He slid a check across the starched white linen, the paper a stark rectangle against the soft glow of the restaurant. "My annual salary," the millionaire Arthur Pembroke said, his voice a low rumble of amusement. "I'll sign it over to you right now." His friends chuckled, the sound like ice clinking in expensive crystal. He tapped a finger on the ancient, inscrutable medallion hanging around his neck. "Just tell me what it says." He looked at the waitress, a girl he hadn't even bothered to learn the name of, with eyes that saw her as nothing more than part of the decor. "Translate this," he smirked, "and my salary is yours." He expected her to blush, to stammer, to walk away defeated. He never expected her to lean in, her eyes suddenly sharp and fiercely intelligent, locking onto the strange script. And in that moment the world shifted on its axis. The air in l'Orangerie Privée was so thick with wealth it felt like a different element, heavier and more rarefied than the smoggy New York City air outside its soundproofed one-way windows. It smelled of seared scallops, vintage Bordeaux, and the subtle competing perfumes of women whose jewelry was worth more than the building they sat in. For Arthur Pembroke, this atmosphere was as familiar and necessary as oxygen. It was the ecosystem he had not just mastered but created. At 42, he possessed the kind of casual arrogance that came from a lifetime of having doors opened, rules bent, and desires instantly gratified. His tech empire, built on a revolutionary data compression algorithm, had made him a billionaire before 30. Now he collected companies the way other men collected watches, and he treated people with the same detached, appraising curiosity. Tonight he was flanked by his usual court. Gregory Thorne, a private equity shark with a predatory grin, and Beatrice Vance, a brittle heiress who dripped condescension as easily as she dripped diamonds. Dinner was a performance, a ritual of power. They dissected markets, dismantled competitors, and laughed at the misfortunes of the less shrewd. For Arthur, however, a familiar ennui had begun to creep in, a creeping grayness at the edges of his gilded world. He'd won the game so completely that it had ceased to be interesting. He found himself looking for new ways to feel something, anything, a spark of surprise in a world that had become utterly predictable. That was when his eyes landed on the waitress. Her name, according to the small silver tag on her uniform, was Isabella. She moved with a quiet efficiency that was almost invisible, a ghost refilling water glasses and clearing plates. She was unobtrusive by design, trained to be a functional part of the restaurant's seamless experience. But Arthur, in his boredom, noticed things. He noticed the way her back was ramrod straight, a posture of disciplined control rather than subservience. He noticed the flicker of intelligence in her dark eyes as she overheard a snippet of their conversation about geopolitical risk, a subtle tightening of her lips that suggested not incomprehension, but perhaps judgment. Most of all, he noticed her hands. They were steady and graceful, but the knuckles were slightly raw, the nails clean but short. The hands of someone who worked, truly worked for a living. "Another bottle of the 82 Petrus," Isabella Gregory called out, snapping his fingers with an entitlement that made even Arthur wince slightly. Isabella didn't flinch. She simply inclined her head. "Of course, Mr. Thorne." Her voice was low and even, with a trace of an accent Arthur couldn't quite place. Not quite Italian, not quite Spanish. It was something else, something older. As she returned with the wine and performed the decanting ritual with practiced precision, Arthur's gaze fell to the object he always wore. The one thing about him that wasn't a calculated acquisition. It was a small, heavy medallion of a strange dark metal hanging from a thick leather cord. It had been his father's and his grandfather's before him. It was a family heirloom, the one piece of their history that predated the money. The surface was covered in a dense flowing script, a language no one in his world could identify. He'd shown it to academics from Yale and historians from the Met. They'd offered theories, a variant of Nabatean perhaps, or a rare Syriac dialect, but none could offer a definitive translation. It was Arthur's one true mystery, a symbol of a past he didn't understand, and he wore it like a dare. Beatrice noticed him toying with it. "Still obsessing over your cryptic little trinket, Arthur," she drawled, taking a delicate sip of her wine. "I thought you'd hired that professor from Cambridge to look at it." "He was useless," Arthur said dismissively. Charged me a fortune to tell me it was likely of Levantine origin. I could have gotten that from a travel brochure. Gregory laughed. Some things money can't buy, I suppose. The secrets of the dead, for one. A wicked, impulsive idea began to form in Arthur's mind. It was cruel, perhaps, but it was interesting. It was a way to shake the table, to disrupt the placid, predictable flow of the evening. He watched Isabella as she leaned over to clear Beatrice's side plate, her focus absolute. She was a cog in his machine, a person paid to be agreeable and invisible. What would happen if he treated her as something more? Not out of respect, but for sport. He waited for her to circle back to his side of the table. As she reached for his empty bread plate, he held up a hand, stopping her. "Isabella," he said, his voice cutting through the low hum of the dining room. She froze, her eyes meeting his. For the first time he saw a flicker of apprehension in them. "Yes, Mr. Pembroke?" He smiled, a slow, predatory curving of his lips. He lifted the medallion from his chest, its weight cool and familiar in his palm. "You've been very attentive tonight, very professional." "Thank you, sir." "I have a proposition for you," he continued, ignoring the intrigued glances from Beatrice and Gregory. "A little game." He let the medallion dangle from its cord, the strange symbols catching the soft amber light. He looked directly at her, at the name tag pinned to her chest, at the faint line of exhaustion under her eyes, at the resolute set of her jaw. He saw a simple waitress, a nobody, and he decided to make her the centerpiece of his evening's entertainment. He had no idea he was about to hand her the key to his entire world, and the weapon that could bring it all crashing down. The silence that descended upon their table was a tangible thing. It pulled the focus of the nearby diners, creating a small pocket of stillness in the bustling restaurant. Isabella stood perfectly still, her hand hovering over the bread plate, her posture radiating attention that belied her calm expression. She was accustomed to the whims of the wealthy, the demanding, the condescending, the overly familiar. But this was different. This felt like a test, a public spectacle orchestrated for reasons she couldn't fathom. Arthur Pembroke savored the moment, the palpable sense of power. This medallion, he began, letting it swing gently like a hypnotist's watch, is very old. And it's inscribed with a message that the most brilliant minds I can hire have been unable to decipher. Beatrice let out a tinkling, condescending laugh. "Arthur, darling, what are you doing?" "The poor girl is just trying to do her job." "Precisely," Arthur said, his eyes never leaving Isabella's. "We are all just doing our jobs. Mine is to make money. Yours," he said, nodding at Beatrice, "is to spend it. And Isabella's is to serve us. But I have a theory. I believe that talent, true genius, can be found anywhere. Don't you agree?" It was a rhetorical question, a philosophical veneer for his cruel game. He felt a perverse thrill, the same one he felt before a hostile takeover. He was setting a trap, and he wanted to watch his quarry squirm. He unclasped the leather cord and laid the heavy medallion on the white tablecloth directly between them. The dark pitted metal looked alien against the pristine fabric. The script was unlike anything modern, composed of sharp, angular marks mixed with elegant, sweeping curves. It looked less like writing and more like a form of intricate, abstract art. "I'm a gambling man, Isabella," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I like to bet on long shots." He reached into his jacket, pulled out a sleek platinum pen and a checkbook from a private bank whose name was synonymous with dynastic wealth. He scribbled a few lines, his movements sharp and decisive. He didn't write a number. He wrote a sentence. "Pay to the order of Isabella Rossi my full annual salary." He left the signature line blank. He pushed the check across the table until it touched the edge of her serving tray. "My annual salary," he repeated louder this time, ensuring the nearby tables could hear. The figure wasn't public knowledge, but everyone in their circle knew it was a number with at least 7, possibly 8 zeros before the decimal. It was a life-changing, world-altering amount of money. "I will sign this check right here, right now, and it is yours." Gregory whistled softly, a look of incredulous amusement on his face. Arthur, you're mad. Am I? Arthur countered, his grin widening. Or am I simply a patron of the hidden arts? He turned his full attention back to Isabella. The spotlight was now entirely on her. He expected a blush of humiliation, a stammered refusal. He expected her to scurry away to the safety of the kitchen to become the subject of amusing gossip for the rest of the evening. The condition is simple, he declared, tapping the medallion. Translate this. Tell me what these ancient scribbles mean. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. The challenge was laid. The trap was set. Translate this, and my salary is yours. Isabella did not blush. She did not stammer. Her eyes, which had been guarded just a moment before, dropped from his face to the medallion on the table. A strange stillness came over her. The nervous energy vanished, replaced by an intense, almost academic focus. Her gaze traced the unfamiliar characters, her lips parting slightly. For a fleeting second, Arthur saw not a waitress, but someone else entirely. He saw a scholar in a library, a cryptographer facing a code, a historian touching a relic for the first time. She looked from the medallion to the check, then back to his face. Her expression was unreadable, a carefully constructed mask of neutrality. He could see the calculations happening behind her eyes. He assumed she was weighing the humiliation against the impossible fantasy of the money. He was wrong. She was weighing the cost of revealing a part of herself she had kept hidden for years, a past she had painstakingly buried under a crisp apron and a polite smile. Inside, Isabella's heart was hammering against her ribs. The script wasn't just familiar. It was a language that had been the subject of her unfinished doctoral dissertation. It was Proto-Aramaic, a specific, notoriously difficult dialect from the 9th century BCE. She had spent 3 years of her life, funded by scholarships and relentless dedication, poring over fragments of similar texts at Columbia University before her family's crisis had forced her to drop out. Her father's catastrophic illness, the mountain of medical bills, and the subsequent collapse of their family business had torn her from the hallowed halls of academia and thrown her into the relentless grind of the service industry. She worked double shifts here and 2 other jobs just to keep her family afloat. And now here it was. The world she had been forced to leave behind presented to her on a silver platter by a man who saw her as less than human, as a plaything for his amusement. The irony was so bitter it almost made her choke. The arrogance of this man, Arthur Pembroke, was staggering. He waved his salary around like a magic wand, believing it could solve any problem, answer any question. Yet he couldn't see the answer standing right in front of him, about to pour him more water. Her pride screamed at her to walk away, to refuse to be a part of his circus. But then she thought of her father, of the experimental treatment they couldn't afford, of her mother's exhausted face. The check on the table wasn't just money. It was a lifeline. It was a chance. She took a slow, deliberate breath, centering herself. She met Arthur's smug gaze, and for the first time that evening, she allowed a flicker of her true self to show through. "You're serious?" she asked, her voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil inside her. "Completely," Arthur purred. "But I don't have all night." "Yes or no?" Isabella picked up the medallion. Her fingers, which had been trembling slightly, were now perfectly still. The metal was cold and heavy, humming with the weight of centuries. The script felt like an old friend. She didn't need a dictionary or a reference book. The words were etched in her memory. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, not for dramatic effect, but to silence the screaming doubt in her mind and access the part of her brain she had thought was dormant forever. She opened them and looked directly at Arthur Pembroke. "Yes," she said. His jaw, which had been set in a confident smirk, dropped ever so slightly. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected her to call his bluff. The game had just become very, very real. The boisterous energy at the table evaporated, replaced by a tense, breathless anticipation. Beatrice leaned forward, her diamonds glinting, a flicker of genuine curiosity in her eyes. Gregory Thorne set his wineglass down with a soft click, his deal-maker's instincts sensing a sudden, unexpected shift in the power dynamic. The stage which Arthur had built for his own amusement now belonged to the waitress. Isabella ignored them all. Her world had narrowed to the small, dark object in her palm. Holding the medallion felt like bridging a gap of nearly 3,000 years. Her fingertips traced the chiseled grooves of the Proto-Aramaic script, feeling the intention of the hand that had carved it so long ago. The dialect was thorny, full of linguistic traps for the uninitiated. Many of the symbols had dual meanings, their interpretation dependent entirely on the syntax and the context of the surrounding characters, a context she had spent years mastering. She turned the medallion over. The inscription continued on the back, a dense block of text that made her breath catch. This wasn't a simple name or a dedication. It was a statement, a record. Well, Arthur prompted, a hint of impatience coloring his tone. He was starting to feel a prickle of unease. Her confidence was unnerving. It wasn't the tentative guess of a charlatan. It was the quiet assurance of an expert. Isabella didn't look up. Patience, she murmured the word, carrying an unconscious authority that silenced him. A text this old deserves respect. She began to read aloud, not the English translation, but the original Aramaic. The words felt foreign and yet profoundly familiar on her tongue. The sound that filled the small bubble of silence around their table was guttural, ancient, and rhythmic. It was a language of stone and dust, of prophets and forgotten kings. It was a sound that had not been heard in that room or perhaps anywhere in the modern world for centuries. In the peace of ancient waters. She began, her voice low and clear. Arthur felt a strange shiver run down his spine. The sounds were alien, yet they seemed to resonate with the object, as if the medallion itself were finally speaking. He had no idea what she was saying, but he knew with a sudden, chilling certainty that it was real. This was no parlor trick. Isabella paused. Her brow furrowed in concentration as she navigated a particularly complex passage. She was translating in her head not just word for word, but idea for idea, wrestling with the ancient grammar and syntax to capture the true intent. She was back in the dusty archives of Columbia's library, the scent of old paper and binding glue in her nostrils, the thrill of discovery coursing through her. After a long minute, she finally looked up, her dark eyes locking onto Arthur's. The playful, servile mask of the waitress was gone completely. In its place was the piercing gaze of a scholar about to deliver a profound and unsettling truth. "It is a record of a debt," she said, her voice even. "And a curse." Beatrice scoffed lightly. "Oh, how dramatic. A curse. What is this, a fantasy novel?" Isabella's gaze shifted to Beatrice, cold and dismissive, before returning to Arthur. She had their undivided attention. The text is what's known as a testament stone. It's a way of recording a binding oath or a significant transgression to be remembered for all time. This particular dialect was common among merchant clans and builders in the Upper Levant around the 9th century BCE. She took a deep breath, choosing her next words carefully. The translation is not simple. There's a metaphor at its heart. She pointed to a specific recurring symbol on the medallion, a stylized bird of prey. This symbol represents a name or a lineage. It translates roughly to the falcon. She then pointed to another symbol, a depiction of a large imposing building block, a keystone. And this represents the other party, a name that can be translated as the builder, or in a more boastful context, the foundation stone. In modern English, you might call him Pembroke. Arthur's blood ran cold. Pembroke. It was his name. He felt the leather cord on his neck now bare, as if a ghost had touched it. The stone speaks of a partnership. Isabella continued, her voice weaving a story that was 3 millennia old. A partnership between the falcon and the Pembroke of that time. They were building something magnificent, a structure of unprecedented design. The falcon was the visionary, the architect. The Pembroke was the craftsman, the one with the resources to make it real. She paused, her eyes lingering on the medallion before she delivered the final, devastating lines. It says, "The foundation is laid on broken faith. The pinnacle is built with a stolen design. The debt of Pembroke to the falcon is not of gold, but of honor. And it will not be paid until the blood of the falcon holds the keystone again, and the truth is brought into the light." The silence that followed was absolute. It was so profound that the distant chime of a fork hitting a plate at another table sounded like a gunshot. The debt of Pembroke. The words echoed in Arthur's mind. A stolen design. A broken faith. This wasn't some generic ancient curse. It was a specific accusation tied directly to his family name. He looked at the medallion, this piece of metal he had worn for years as a symbol of his opaque and mysterious heritage, and for the first time he saw it as something ugly, a monument to a crime. Gregory was the first to speak, his voice a low rasp. That's impossible. It's a coincidence, a clever story she's spinning. But Arthur knew it wasn't. He had felt the truth of it in the marrow of his bones as she spoke the ancient words. He looked at Isabella, truly looked at her, and a terrifying question began to form in his mind. Who was this woman? How could a waitress in New York City read a language that had baffled the world's leading experts? His game was over. The board had been flipped, and he was no longer a player, but a piece. The ennui he had felt earlier was gone, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. The mystery he had longed for had arrived, and it was threatening to unravel not just his past, but his very identity. Without a word, he picked up the platinum pin. His hand was perfectly steady as he signed his name on the line at the bottom of the check. The swooping, confident signature that had sealed billion-dollar deals now sealed a debt he never knew he owed. He slid the check back across the table. "You won," he said, his voice a hollow shell of its former arrogance. Isabella looked at the check, at the astronomical sum now legally hers. Then she looked at him, and her eyes held not triumph but a deep, unsettling pity. She picked up the check, folded it neatly, and slipped it into her apron pocket. "The debt," she said, softly placing the medallion back into his hand, "is not paid in gold." The following days were a study in contrasts. For Isabella Rossi, the world exploded with possibility. The check, which cleared without issue 2 days after that fateful dinner, was an almost incomprehensible sum of money. The first thing she did was pay off every cent of her family's medical debt in a single wire transfer. She watched the confirmation screen on the bank's website, the words, "Payment successful," glowing in green, and felt a pressure release from her chest that she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying for years. It felt like breathing after being held underwater. She moved her parents from their cramped walk-up apartment in Queens to a comfortable, sunlit home in a quiet suburban neighborhood with a garden. She hired the best physical therapist for her father and a full-time nurse to help her mother. For the first time since she was 19, she slept through the night without the gnawing anxiety of impending bills and financial ruin. Yet amidst this profound relief, the words from the medallion haunted her. The blood of the falcon. It was just a story, a coincidence of language, she told herself. Her family name, Rossi, was common. It had no connection to some ancient artisan clan. But the thought was a splinter in her mind impossible to ignore. With her family settled and secure, a different kind of hunger reawakened in her, the hunger for knowledge. She didn't buy a sports car or a penthouse. Instead, she walked back onto the campus of Columbia University, not as a former student burdened with regret, but as a prospective one with a renewed sense of purpose. She met with her old mentor, Professor Albright, a man with a shock of white hair and eyes that still sparkled with intellectual curiosity. When she told him a sanitized version of the story that she had come into an inheritance and wanted to finish her PhD, he was overjoyed. But when she showed him a meticulously drawn sketch of the medallion and its inscription, his professional excitement eclipsed his personal happiness for her. "Isabella, my dear, where did you find this?" He breathed, his fingers tracing the drawing as if it were the relic itself. The syntax, the iconography. It's a perfect example of a 9th century BCE Damascene variant. We have fragments, of course, but a complete text of this length. It's unheard of. This is a Rosetta Stone for its specific dialect. She spent the next few weeks in the library not as a waitress dreaming of a different life, but as a scholar living it. The check from Arthur Pembroke had bought her freedom, but the medallion had given her back her identity. Surrounded by ancient texts and linguistic charts, she began a new investigation. She cross-referenced the symbols for Falcon and Pembroke with historical records, trade manifests, and epigraphic databases. She told herself it was purely an academic exercise, a way to add a groundbreaking chapter to her dissertation. But deep down, she knew she was searching for a connection, a link between the ancient curse and the strange, unsettling emptiness in her own family's history. Her grandfather had always spoken of their ancestors as being more than just humble laborers of a great betrayal that had sent them from Italy to America with nothing but the clothes on their backs. But he never knew the details. It had always been dismissed as the wistful ramblings of an old man. Now she wasn't so sure. For Arthur Pembroke, the world had shrunk. His gilded cage had become an actual prison, its walls papered with questions he couldn't answer. The money, the power, the sycophants, it all felt like a hollow distraction from the chasm that had opened up beneath his feet. He had built his identity on the Pembroke name, on the legacy of shrewd, successful men who had carved an empire from nothing. Now that legacy was tainted by the words stolen design and broken faith. He canceled his meetings. He ignored calls from Gregory and Beatrice. He spent hours in his penthouse office, the medallion sitting on his desk, radiating a cold judgment. He couldn't shake the image of Isabella's eyes, the way she had looked at him with pity. She hadn't just translated a text, she had passed a verdict. His first move was to do what he always did when faced with a problem: throw money and resources at it. He hired the best corporate investigation firm in the country, but he didn't want them looking into balance sheets. He wanted a genealogist, a historian, an archaeologist. He was assigned their top operative, a woman named Genevieve Dubois. She was a formidable, razor-sharp woman in her 50s, with a reputation for unearthing secrets that powerful families had buried for centuries. "Mr. Pembroke," Genevieve said during their first meeting, her voice crisp and businesslike as she examined the medallion. "What exactly are we looking for?" "The truth," Arthur said, the word feeling foreign in his mouth. "I want to know where this came from. I want to know about the Pembrokes of the 9th century BCE. And he hesitated, the name feeling like ash on his tongue. "I want to know about the Falcon." Genevieve's investigation was ruthlessly efficient. She dispatched teams to the Levant, to museums in London and Berlin, and to the deepest, most obscure archives of historical records. But her most significant discoveries began closer to home, in the dusty, leather-bound ledgers of Arthur's own great-grandfather Silas Pembroke, the man credited with building the family fortune in the late 19th century. Silas Pembroke had been an architect and an industrialist, his name synonymous with the great steel and stone structures that defined the New York skyline. The official story was that he was a lone genius, a visionary who had revolutionized civil engineering. But Genevieve found anomalies. In an old private journal, Silas wrote obsessively about a new method for reinforcing large-scale masonry, a technique involving pre-stressed stone and internal iron frameworks that was decades ahead of its time. It was the very innovation that had made his first, most famous skyscraper possible. Then Genevieve found the payment ledgers from that first project. There were dozens of entries for masons, for laborers, for suppliers, and one recurring significant payment made out to a small family-run artisan company, a firm of Italian immigrants who specialized in intricate stonework and architectural design. The name of the firm was Falcone & Sons. Genevieve placed the file on Arthur's desk. "Falcone is the Italian word for falcon, Mr. Pembroke," she said, her expression neutral. The company was owned by a man named Antonio Falcone. According to these records, he and his sons were lead consultants on the structural and aesthetic design of the Pembroke Tower. They worked closely with your great-grandfather for 2 years. Arthur felt his stomach clench. "And what happened to them?" Genevieve flipped to the next page. It was a newspaper clipping from 1888. The headline was small, buried in the back pages: "Tragic Workshop Fire Claims Lives of Local Artisans." The article detailed a sudden, devastating fire at the Falcone & Sons workshop. Antonio Falcone and his 2 eldest sons had perished. The New York Police Department had ruled it an accident caused by volatile chemicals used for treating stone. All of their designs, blueprints, and records were destroyed in the blaze. 2 weeks after the fire, Genevieve said, her voice dropping, your great-grandfather Silas Pembroke filed a series of patents. Patents for the very same revolutionary masonry techniques he had been developing with Antonio Falcone. With Falcone and his heirs dead, there was no one to contest the claim. Silas became the sole owner of the intellectual property. That patent became the bedrock of the Pembroke Empire. The air in the room grew thick and cold. The ancient curse from the medallion was no longer a whisper from the distant past. It was a scream echoing down through the generations from a suspicious fire in a 19th-century workshop directly to the penthouse office, where Arthur now sat shaking. The debt was not of gold. It was of honor. And it was a debt owed not to some long-dead ancient mystic, but to a family his own ancestor had seemingly erased from history. The revelation of Antonio Falcone and the suspicious fire sent Arthur into a spiral. The story of his family, the one he'd inherited and built upon, was a lie. The foundation of his entire existence wasn't the genius of Silas Pembroke. It was the ashes of the Falcone workshop. He felt like a man living in a magnificent house who had just discovered its foundations were made of sand and bone. Every portrait of his great-grandfather hanging in the family estate now seemed to mock him, the stern visionary eyes now looking cunning and cruel. His investigation with Genevieve Dubois deepened. They started searching for any surviving members of the Falcone family. The trail was cold, nearly a century and a half old. After the fire, Antonio's wife and youngest son, the sole survivor, had vanished from New York. Records from that era were sparse, especially for immigrant families with little money or influence. It was as if they had been swallowed by the city's vast, unforgiving anonymity. Genevieve, however, was relentless. She tracked them through census data, ship manifests, and church records. She found a name change a common practice for immigrants seeking to assimilate or escape a painful past. The family had anglicized their name, but not entirely. They had chosen a name that was a direct, if subtle, translation of their heritage. A name that meant red in Italian, a color associated with certain species of falcons. Rossi. When Genevieve presented the file to Arthur, his hands trembled as he opened it. The genealogical chart was a stark, branching tree of hardship and resilience. It traced the line from Antonio Falcone's surviving son down through generations of laborers, shopkeepers, and factory workers. They had never recovered the status or skill of their ancestor. They were a family perpetually struggling, living in the long, dark shadow of a forgotten tragedy. The final branch on the chart ended with a single name, beside which was a recent photo from a university ID card. Isabella Rossi. Arthur stared at the photograph. It was her, but younger, her face full of the fierce academic intensity he had only glimpsed for a moment in the restaurant. The coincidence was too great, too cosmic to be believed. The one person on earth who could read the ancient Aramaic curse was also the last living descendant of the very family his ancestor had betrayed. It was fate, or perhaps something more. It was a debt coming due. He felt a wave of nausea. His challenge in the restaurant, his arrogant, cruel game, had been an act of staggering karmic irony. He had dangled his salary, a fortune built on the ruin of her family, as a prize for her to reveal the very story of that ruin. The universe wasn't just nudging him toward the truth. It was screaming it in his face. Meanwhile, Isabella's own research was leading her down a parallel path. Working with Professor Albright, she secured access to archives she could never have afforded to enter on her own. She analyzed the metallurgical composition of the medallion, tracing the unique alloy to a specific mountain range near ancient Damascus, a region known for its highly skilled metalworkers and masons. The curse wasn't just a generic screed. It was imbued with the physical identity of its creators. Her focus, however, shifted from the ancient world to the more recent past. Haunted by her grandfather's fragmented stories of betrayal, she began to investigate her own family history. Using the university's extensive databases, she searched for the name Falcone. She found the records of Falcone and Sons stonemasons from Genoa, Italy, who who had immigrated to New York in the 1870s. She read about their innovative techniques, their growing reputation, and their high-profile contract with a rising industrialist named Silas Pembroke. Then she found the article about the fire. Reading the faded newsprint on the microfilm reader felt like being punched in the gut. The names, the date, the location, it all aligned with the vague, tragic oral history that had been passed down through her family. But here was the proof. Her great-great-grandfather and his sons murdered not by accident, but by greed. The story described the complete loss of their workshop, including all plans and proprietary design models. The next article she found, dated 3 weeks later, was an announcement in the Financial Times of Silas Pembroke's groundbreaking new patent for reinforced keystone construction. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying, sickening finality. Her family hadn't just been unfortunate. They had been erased. Their legacy, their genius had been stolen and rebranded as the foundation of the Pembroke dynasty. The immense wealth of the man who had mocked her in the restaurant, the very money now sitting in her bank account, was stained with the blood and ashes of her ancestors. The medallion was not a coincidence. It was a witness. But how did it connect? The ancient world and the 19th century, how did they link? The answer came from an obscure footnote in a book on 19th century Freemasonry and other secret societies. It mentioned that Silas Pembroke was a high-ranking member of a clandestine fraternity of industrialists and financiers who saw themselves as modern-day master builders. They appropriated ancient symbols and rituals to lend a sense of mystique and historical weight to their capitalist ambitions. They were known to collect artifacts from the ancient world, particularly those related to construction and architecture, as symbols of their power. Isabella realized the truth instantly. Silas Pembroke hadn't inherited the medallion from his ancient ancestors. He had acquired it. He had likely purchased the testament stone of the ancient Pembroke clan as a symbol for his own burgeoning dynasty. He had adopted their name as his own symbol. And in a feat of cosmic irony, he had then committed the very same sin as the man memorialized on the stone, a betrayal of his partner the falcon in the pursuit of a great architectural achievement. The medallion was not just a historical record. It was a prophecy that Silas Pembroke had unwittingly fulfilled. He had worn the evidence of his crime around his neck, passing it down through the generations, a ticking time bomb of truth, waiting for someone who could read the language of the betrayed. And now she had. She sat back in the library chair, the silence of the room pressing in on her. The money in her account felt dirty, like blood money. It was a fraction of what was stolen. This was no longer an academic exercise. This was about justice. Not just for her, but for the generations of Falcones, of Rosses, who had lived and died in poverty while the Pembrokes built an empire on their stolen dreams. She knew she had to see him again. She pulled out her phone, found the number for the Pembroke corporate headquarters, and placed a call. She didn't ask for a reservation. She demanded a meeting. The meeting was not held in a boardroom or a restaurant. At Isabella's insistence, they met at the base of the Pembroke Tower, the century-old skyscraper that had been Silas Pembroke's first and greatest triumph. It was a Gothic masterpiece of steel and dark stone, a monument to ambition that clawed at the Manhattan sky. To Arthur, it had always been a symbol of his family's genius. Today, it looked like a tombstone. It was a cold, gray afternoon. The wind whipped between the city's canyons, carrying with it the scent of rain. Arthur waited by the grand arched entrance, feeling uncharacteristically small and exposed. He had traded his bespoke suit for a simple cashmere sweater and slacks, a subconscious shedding of the armor he no longer felt he had the right to wear. When Isabella arrived, she too was dressed simply in a dark wool coat that did little to fend off the chill. The subservient demeanor of the waitress was a distant memory. She approached him with the resolute stride of an equal, her eyes clear and unyielding. There was no anger in her gaze, but something far more potent, the weight of a truth that could no longer be denied. "Thank you for meeting me here," she said, her voice steady against the rush of the traffic. "It seemed appropriate," Arthur replied, his voice hoarse. For a moment they stood in silence. Two strangers bound by a crime that spanned 3,000 years and 4 generations. The chasm between the billionaire and the waitress had vanished, replaced by the far deeper, more complex chasm between the houses of Pembroke and Falcone. "I know who you are," Arthur said finally, the admission costing him more than any business deal ever had. "I know what my great-grandfather did to your family." Isabella nodded slowly, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. "I know too. I found the records, the fire, the patents, all of it." She gestured up at the magnificent building looming over them. "This was supposed to be our legacy too. My great-great-grandfather Antonio Falcone, he poured his soul into the design for this place. The internal support structure, the way the keystones distribute the weight. It was his life's work." She reached into her bag and pulled out a worn leather-bound journal. It was her grandfather's. He never knew the details, but the story of the betrayal was passed down. He called it the shadow debt. He wrote that the Falcones had a secret, a way of building that was like magic, and that a man of stone stole it. Arthur felt a fresh wave of shame. A shadow debt. That was exactly what it was. The medallion, Isabella continued, her gaze intense, was the key. "When I researched Silas Pembroke, I found out he was a collector of antiquities. He didn't inherit that stone from some ancient ancestor. He bought it. He appropriated the name and the symbol because he saw himself as a master builder, just like the Pembroke on the stone. And then he repeated the very same transgression." She looked up at the building again, her eyes tracing the high arching lines. "The irony is what makes it so monstrous. He wore a confession of his own crime, passed it down as a family treasure, never knowing what it truly said. He hid his secret in plain sight." Arthur finally met her eyes, his own filled with a despair she hadn't expected. "The money I gave you. It feels like a bribe to stay silent," she finished for him, her voice hardening slightly. "A pittance to cover up a generational theft that created your empire." The accusation hung in the cold air between them. It was true, and they both knew it. The salary he had so arrogantly offered was a pathetic, insulting fraction of what was owed. Justice here wasn't a simple transaction. It was a fundamental reordering of their two realities. "What do you want from me, Isabella?" Arthur asked, his voice raw. "Tell me what to do." This was the moment. She could destroy him. With her research and his own internal investigation files, she could go to the press. The story would be a sensation, the celebrated Pembroke dynasty exposed as a fraud, its origins rooted in theft and possibly murder. She could sue him for a share of the fortune, a legal battle that would drag both their families through the mud for years. The rage she felt for her family's stolen past, for her own years of struggle, tempted her. It was a siren song of vengeance. But as she looked at Arthur Pembroke, she didn't see the arrogant billionaire from the restaurant. She saw a man utterly broken by the truth, stripped of his identity and legacy. Destroying him would feel good for a moment, but it wouldn't rebuild what was lost. It wouldn't restore her family's name. Vengeance would only create more wreckage. "I don't want to destroy you, Arthur," she said, and she was surprised to find that she meant it. "But I want the truth to be known. I want the name Falcone to be chiseled into the stone of this building right next to Pembroke. I want the world to know who the visionary was." She took a deep breath, the next part harder to say. "And I want the debt to be repaid, not to me, to the world that was deprived of my family's genius." Arthur listened, his expression shifting from despair to a dawning fragile hope. She wasn't asking for a payout. She was asking for restoration, for justice in its purest form. "Tell me," he said. "I want you to establish a foundation," she stated, her voice gaining strength and purpose. "The Pembroke Falcone Foundation. Its mission will be to fund brilliant minds, architects, engineers, artists who have the vision but lack the resources. It will find the modern-day Falcones of the world and give them the chances my family never had. It will be funded not by a donation, but by a significant legally binding percentage of Pembroke Industries' annual profits. a perpetual tithe, a debt paid forever. It was an audacious proposal. It wasn't just asking for money. It was demanding a piece of his empire's soul, permanently linking his family's name with hers in an act of public penance and creation. It was a solution he could never have conceived of on his own, not destructive, but transformative. He looked from her determined face to the stone facade of the tower, then back. He saw the path forward, a way to build something new and meaningful from the rubble of his family's lies. It was a way to pay the shadow debt not with gold, but with honor. Yes, Arthur said, the single word carrying the weight of a lifetime. Yes. We will do it. In the shadow of the great stone tower, the descendant of the builder and the descendant of the falcon finally shook hands. It wasn't an agreement between a billionaire and a waitress. It was a treaty between two ancient warring houses, finally after 3,000 years making peace. The keystone was being held by the blood of the falcon once more, not to lock away a secret, but to build a new foundation. The announcement sent shockwaves through the worlds of finance, architecture, and philanthropy. It wasn't a press release. It was a public confession and a declaration of a new purpose. Arthur Pembroke stood before a crowd of journalists and industry leaders, not in a sterile conference room, but in the grand marble lobby of the Pembroke Tower. Beside him stood Isabella Rossi. He didn't spare himself or his family. He told the whole story, from the ancient medallion to the betrayal of Antonio Falcone by his great-grandfather Silas. He spoke of the stolen patents, the suspicious fire, and the generations of lies that had propped up his family's name. The raw honesty of his speech left the usually cynical press corps stunned into silence. He stripped away the myth of the Pembroke genius and replaced it with a complex, painful truth. Then he introduced Isabella, not as a waitress he had once mocked, but as the scholar who unearthed the truth and the rightful heir to half of this building's legacy. He announced the official permanent renaming of his flagship company to Pembroke Falcone Industries. He unveiled the plans for a new cornerstone to be laid at the entrance of the tower with the name Antonio Falcone carved in equal prominence to Silas Pembroke. But the centerpiece of the announcement was the foundation. The Pembroke Falcone Foundation for Visionary Design was established with an initial endowment that made it one of the largest philanthropic organizations of its kind in the world. As Isabella had demanded, it was further funded by a legally mandated 10% of the company's annual profits in perpetuity. Its mission was simple and profound: to seek out and support brilliance in the margins, to ensure that no future Falcone would have their legacy stolen or erased. Isabella was named the foundation's executive director. The board was a hand-picked collection of the world's leading architects, historians, and ethicists. Her life transformed once more. She completed her Ph.D. in record time, her dissertation on the Pembroke Medallion becoming a landmark text in the field of ancient linguistics. But her real work was now with the foundation. She traveled the world, not to luxury resorts, but to community colleges, to inner-city workshops, to remote villages searching for raw, unrecognized talent. She found a young woman in Detroit with a revolutionary idea for sustainable housing, a self-taught engineer in Brazil who had designed a new water purification system, and an artist in her native Italy who was reimagining public spaces. The foundation didn't just give them grants, it gave them mentorship, resources, and a platform. It gave them the chance her great-great-grandfather never had. Arthur, for his part, receded from the daily operations of his company, entrusting it to a new CEO. His focus became the foundation, but he took a background role, serving as a quiet advisor on the board. The arrogance that had once defined him was gone, replaced by a quiet, determined humility. He found a new purpose, not in acquisition, but in restitution. He spent his time and his remaining fortune overseeing historical restoration projects, unearthing other stories of injustice buried in the foundations of industry. He and Isabella forged an unlikely, powerful partnership built on a shared commitment to righting the wrongs of the past. They were not friends in a conventional sense. The chasm of history between their families was too vast to ever be fully bridged, but they were allies bound by a common goal. One crisp autumn afternoon, a year after their meeting at the tower, Arthur found Isabella standing before the newly installed cornerstone. The names were there side by side in deep gilded letters: Silas Pembroke and Antonio Falcone. He would have been proud, Arthur said softly, coming to stand beside her. Isabella didn't look at him, her gaze fixed on her ancestor's name finally given its due. He would have been horrified that it took this long, she replied, though her voice lacked its former edge. There was a sense of peace in her posture. The first class of Falcone Fellows was announced today, Arthur said. 10 of them. Their ideas. They're going to change the world. Isabella finally turned to him, a small, genuine smile touching her lips. That was always the point. To build something better. The debt of Pembroke to the Falcon had been a complex one, a tangle of honor, blood, and history. It couldn't be paid with a single check written on a dare. It could only be paid through 1,000 new beginnings, through the funding of 1,000 new dreams. It was paid not by erasing the past, but by using its painful truths to build a more just and beautiful future. One visionary, one design. One restored legacy at a time. The curse had been broken, transformed into a blessing that would echo for generations to come. That single moment in the restaurant, a cruel joke born of boredom and arrogance, became a catalyst for generational change. It reminds us that history is never truly buried. It lives on in the objects we carry, the names we inherit, and the stories we forget to tell. Isabella and Arthur's journey shows us that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in honor, truth, and the courage to right a historical wrong. It's a powerful testament to the idea that one person armed with knowledge and integrity can indeed move mountains and rewrite legacies. If this story of a hidden past and a debt finally repaid moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button to help us share it with more people. What did you find most powerful about their story? Let us know in the comments below. And for more incredible real-life dramas and stories that uncover the secrets hidden just beneath the surface, make sure you subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell. You won't want to miss what we uncover next. Thank you for listening.